Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Carl Fitzpatrick.
Southeast Radio.
Well, rising costs are impacting every sector of the economy right now, and the ever-increasing costs of materials is having a severe impact on the construction sector. Kevin James is the recently elected President of the Society of Chartered Surveyors of Ireland, and he joins us now to tell us about the actions which need to be implemented by government to assist the sector and to reach housing targets. Kevin, before we discuss your role with the SCSI, I'd like to hear about your own business, Cogent Associates.
Good morning, Carl. Delighted to be here. We're a company that's been in business now for 23 years this year, called Cogent Associates. We specialise in providing project management, cost management, and a range of consultancy services. I suppose we work across a wide range of sectors, which would include residential, commercial, retail and leisure, hospitality and logistics and infrastructure, etc. But I suppose we also work, not just for the private sector, but also for the public sector, delivering some small, medium and large scale projects. Some of the better known projects that we've been associated with would be the Cork School of Music, or the Central Bank's new headquarters a number of years ago, or Google's headquarters. Currently, we're involved in, I suppose, a range of exciting projects across Ireland. We're down in Limerick as part of the Limerick Regeneration Plan, delivering Project Opera, and that's a very exciting project, which is, part of regenerating the heart of Limerick. And we're also working, for a number of international and local clients, delivering residential schemes, offices and education projects.
And talk to me about the work that the Society of Chartered Surveyors does and why you had ambitions to become president of it.
Yeah, I think for me, coming back from the UK to Dublin back then, I suppose that the Society, it spans land, property and construction. And with the members, to me, it gave me a great insight into how the industry worked in Ireland. And, it was very welcoming for a start in terms of just the membership. And as I began to build relationships with the members and listening to, I suppose many of the opinions across, the various disciplines in the society, it was very clear to me that I suppose that with the membership and the collective strength of the membership, we were probably unparalleled in terms of providing advice to the industry and our understanding of the coalface. So I suppose, when I look at, the reports that we've been working on over the course of the last few years, we've been addressing, the MICA report more recently, agriculture and land reviews, tender price inflation. We talk about sustainable development, and I suppose we publish papers on the residential property market. So again, the combination of that experience across the SCSI for me is, it allows us to inform the decision makers in the industry, for us to make our contribution with evidence-based information. And I think that's very important because, the society as a professional body is based on the voluntary membership, and the time that the members give. And that time, really helps inform where the industry is going.
Of course, no sector has been immune to the increase in costs, but provide us with an insight into some of the other challenges that your members are bringing to your attention now.
The impact of rising construction costs has been well documented. I suppose, to me, it's bringing huge uncertainty and instability globally and locally, to Ireland. And with the uncertainty, to me, that affects risk because budgets and tenders that have been tendered in the past 6 months, they've come back over budget. And when projects come back from the market over budget, that affects the viability. And what I've seen, probably the coalface and talking to members, is over the past 6 months in particular, we've seen a significant amount of rising costs, and we've seen material price inflation, increased margins from contractors because of the supply and the demand issue. The war in the Ukraine, I suppose there's been huge issues with supply of materials coming into the country. And then more recently, with the high energy costs with oil and gas, all of those are contributing factors to increased costs. I suppose when I look at the moment, a lot of the clients that we're dealing with, I suppose, are asking us, should they proceed or not with their particular development? And that's a difficult call because I think the answer, is different for each and every project and different clients, whether they're on the private side of the industry or the public side of the industry. With the public sector, there's a massive demand for social housing, yet what we're seeing is that there's a lack of interest from contractors tendering, and that's potentially as a consequence of the public procurement rules and regulations that contractors are seeing. There's too much risk in those particular contracts for contractors to price, and there's more attractive terms in the private side at the moment, which is causing a huge difficulty for the government in their Housing for All plan. We're seeing signs that the market is beginning to slow across a number of sectors. Last week I was reading about Kingspan, who noted a significant drop in orders, and I think I'm also seeing that across a number of other key suppliers in the industry. So in some respects, if projects do become stalled, it may open some capacity and bring some competition into the market, but it's too early to tell. There are signs there of a global recession, and I think only recently the World Bank had announced, that a lot of countries, will potentially they're headed for a recession, basically. So I think, for us as an industry, how do we prepare for that, and how do we bring competition into the market so we can get value for money and get projects started on site, particularly in the social housing arena?
And Kevin, from a practical perspective, what percentage increases have you actually witnessed on tenders?
Tender price inflation varies from sector to sector and project to project, dependent on the size, scale and complexity of that particular project. Over the past 6 months, we have seen a significant increase in some of the tenders coming back. If we go out to the market and we're inviting 6 tenders back, the percentage increase across the 6 contractors could be upwards of between 10 and 15% of a variance compared to our budget. And I suppose some of the larger projects, again, depending on the risk profile of the contract, where the materials are being sourced from, there are particular premiums that apply to elements of the building, which will have an impact on the overall increase on inflation for that particular project.
And Kevin, you have a great insight into the supply chains of construction materials. How long more do you think that the shortage of materials is going to happen for?
It's a difficult one to answer. I think we've got some pent-up demand there across the industry at the moment, and a number of private sector clients are pressing on with certain projects. And whilst the demand is still there, it's going to be difficult to see in the short term whether the material prices are going to have a level of correction. I think we are beginning to see some sort of green shoots of certain materials and elements within the building reducing, because if I go back to the middle of last year, we were looking at reinforcement prices at 550 to 600 euro a tonne. By Christmas of that year, it went to 900, and then it went to 1200, and then it went up to 1400 as recently as last month. But as we've looked into the European supply chains, we've seen a 20% reduction in that particular element of the building. Now, it's not as competitive as it was, but we are beginning to see some materials come down in price.
And with all of these headwinds facing the construction sector, what does it all mean for the government's Housing for All targets?
I think the government's Housing for All targets are under huge pressure at the moment, and that comes back to the viability and the procurement processes that they're using to attract contractors to price for housing developments across the country. And, while we've seen a number of projects that are not attracting 5 or 6 contractors to tender for them, and some local authorities are lucky if they get 1 or 2 contractors submitting a price, which may result in 1 contractor, which to me is very difficult to, I suppose, look at the whole procurement process. And we've made recommendations to government within the Oireachtas there last month as to whether or not they should, make some reforms within public procurement to allow, those particular projects to be more attractive to the contracting industry.
And what specific actions would you like to see the government take?
I suppose when I look at the capital expenditure programme, that the government have at the moment, I think everything's at risk when you consider not just the Housing for All programme, but across, lots of different sectors because of the viability issue. The Society presented a number of recommendations to the government within the Oireachtas at the end of May. And a number of them, focused on, the planning process and, a call for some serious reforms to be made with the planning process and the delays that projects have incurred, to get approval. if you consider how long it takes to get a project into planning, if a project sits in planning for 6 or 9 months or a year in delay, the inflationary impact of that could have been 12, 13% upwards of last year, and that took us up to December. So, again, whilst that project might have come through planning, it's also going to be burdened now with additional costs if it gets approval to go to site. We've called on the government to introduce some public procurement reforms. And again, the government have introduced a cooperation inflation agreement a few months ago. And I suppose it's too early to tell how the industry is going to respond to that because it's a cooperation agreement. And once the contracting industry look at the level of recovery they may get from government for material price inflation, time will tell whether or not that cooperation agreement is going to be accepted. We've also called on the government to provide more resources to local authorities, to I suppose expedite some of the decision making, because I think across local authorities, like everywhere else, there are skill shortages, but there does need to be some focused attention there to make sure some local authorities are better resourced. We've called on the government to look at fees and charges that are linked to inflation. When you're building up your business case, there are fees and charges imposed by local authorities, and within the society we've asked for some of those fees to be paused or reduced just to contribute towards making the projects more viable. One of the main ones, I suppose, is really the ESB and Irish Water. The sentiment is that a number of projects have reached practical completion, but the ESB, I suppose, and to some extent Irish Water, have been under huge pressure to provide power and water to certain sites, for servicing those. What we've asked for is to give better visibility on those particular projects that are ready to go to site, and allow, I suppose, that not only the client but also the contractor a better understanding of completion dates to bring housing projects to site. I suppose the final one really is a request that we look at fire regulations, and what we've seen is there's different views from different fire officers across the country in the interpretation of the regulations. And again, the fire regulations, very, very important that we maintain full standards with the fire integrity of buildings, but equally it's making sure that that there is a consistency of message from different local authorities to clients.
And Kevin, finally, what is your outlook for the construction sector in Ireland over the next 3 years?
Well, I suppose this year it's been a year like no other. As I begin my presidency, I look at where we've been. My business, we're in business now 23 years, and we've seen the cycle of the construction industry. And I think the outlook for the next 3 years is quite difficult. I think with the war in the Ukraine and the disruption that's caused, across the globe, I think, and looking at the sentiment from the World Bank, there is, potentially, tougher times on the horizon for everybody. I think the government and the capital expenditure programme, I think that's really, something that's really important that we shouldn't lose sight of. There's a significant amount of investment. There's a massive demand for housing and residential across the country. So there is a lot of work to do. I suppose if we're able to unlock the viability problem, we will be able to sustain the industry.
Well, if you've just tuned in, that was the President of the Society of Chartered Surveyors of Ireland, Kevin James. And I'd like to thank Kevin for joining us on this morning's show.
Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Carl Fitzpatrick.
Southeast.